Chapter 6 Meetings After Restructuring. Our psyche gets cracked by small fragments. Because of the strong stress that arises from traumatic events, our psyche gets cracked by rigid fragments. To unify the psyche, we need a systemized approach to assemble and restructure our fragments, analyzing and classifying our responses. The sign of the originality of our psyche is the unpredictable responses to similar stimulations. In contrast, after the trauma, we have similar responses to diverse stimulations. Our similar responses are in the same form of expression and are called common fragments. They are the sign of the unstable psyche, which is copying similar responses from others. In a computer language, our fragmented psyche is the combination of small files that form our responses. Our files are not combined together in a directory and are in various sensory forms. The processes have not controlled and generate similar or dissimilar responses. We are not consciously aware of our internal processes and do not know where and how our responses are generated. Our psyche has groups that consist of the combination of the fragments, and we need to identify them. Our fixated fragments are in dysfunctional groups and are based on distorted perceptions of visual, oral, kinesthetic, tactile, and olfactory stimulation. When our fragments with diverse responses assemble in groups, we easily observe the discrepancies in our perception. Our fragments have atypical ways of interaction, and some of them are under the strong control of domineering fragments, but some are loosely associated. When we have a loose association, we do not accept commands from the domineering fragments and are driven by a desire for independence. We feel guilty after our loosely associated fragments act out against our domineering fragments. When loyalty to the domineering fragments takes over our psyche, the devoted fragments are subservient to the domineering fragments. Our psyche has a complex structure. To understand it is important in identifying the power struggle between our fixated fragments. A more stable identity consists of several groups that actively interact, cooperate, and exhibit plasticity. To reorganize our fragments, we need to identify all groups. When on a conscious level, the draft of our psyche is complete. We can rearrange the relationships between groups and the relationships of our fragments within the groups. In our cohesive groups, we restructure our individual responses. The process of unifying the psyche creates a conscious awareness of the differences. We achieve the unification of the similar responses to the common groups. The congruence of the translation of stimuli to various styles of expression is the most important task. We do not want our stimulations to be lost in translation. A proper translation is a basic rule for having congruent responses. We assemble our distorted responses in common groups, get them under conscious control, and rearrange them. Our goal in the restructuring of our misdirected and isolated groups is to establish the relationship between them. Even though we act intuitively, we are stronger when we have congruency in our responses. Our identity gets more solid than a psyche with contrasting responses. The link between the body and the mind, the story of Lola. In many studies, the emphasis on dialogue between the body and mind is very important and is a recognizable topic of discussion despite the difference in the systems and approaches. One of Lola's fragments belonged to a sexually abused little girl who was very frightened and experienced a frozen sensation when she was in front of perceived danger. Lola was aware that her responses were wrong, but did not have the strength to move. She was a very depressed and unhappy woman. She was not able to identify the fragments in her psyche. She could not bring her fragments together, and they did not have dialogue between her body and her mind. Lola lost cohesiveness and was driven by loose fragments to a split of her identity. Her rigid fragments affected her with a very painful and depressing responses, and she processed stimuli with damaged structures. Her decisions were built on forces of split. To overcome her problems, Lola translated her kinesthetic feeling to a visual modality. The translation of her responses appeared to be similar to the feeling of driving a car without brakes. Lola also translated her kinesthetic response to the olfactory form, like being in a burning house without any available exits and exhaling the fumes. She processed her feelings by identifying the fragments, meeting with them, and having a dialogue between the fragments. She took conscious control over her mind and over her reactions to her traumatic past, using the dialogue between the body and mind to get relief from the freezing kinesthetic sensations. Lola synthesized her body's reaction and the struggles of her mind. In the past, her fragments were operating on a subconscious level, but now she consciously identified her fragments. Similarly, a computer has a unique level of operating and processes the low-level and high-level languages. If we work on the computers with high-level languages, we are not concerned about the machine's low-level language. The restructuring helped Lola get relief from her freezing through a restructuring of her fragments. After becoming consciously aware of her fragments, Lola provided the translation of her responses and used the dialogue between body and mind to move from the kinesthetic to the oral and visual experiences. Lola translated her kinesthetic reaction from the frightening event, from the domineering modality, to other modalities. Lola achieved the restructuring of her brain's chemicals by the psychological analysis of distinct fragments. Lola translated her freezing sensation as similar to stammering. Lola felt like she could not achieve proper pronunciation of words, and she couldn't say much. The analysis of fragments created opportunities for Lola to receive help, to restructure her fragments without pharmacological intervention. In the past, Lola was not able to successfully treat psychological sicknesses, but the new knowledge opened up a new frontier. The Fixated Fragments is the story of Lola. Before the trauma, Lola's flexible fragments communicated with and supported her main fragments. After the trauma, her fixated fragments became loosely associated and were no longer under the control of her domineering fragments. Loose fragments easily replaced her old fragments. Because it was hard to adjust to a painful experience, Lola's psyche split. She suffered from low self-esteem and unhappiness, and she had many fixated fragments. Her fixated and loose fragments spontaneously took over her psyche and became her main fragments. But they looked like generals without an army and were in power for only a short time. The main fragment was the one who at a particular time dominated Lola's psyche and provided directions for her responses. In Lola's life, her fixated fragments were a disturbance, and they were associated with overreaction and the deformation of responses. The fixated fragments in Lola's psyche drifted away from the other fragments and functioned semi-independently, ignoring other fragments. Because of the traumatic experience, her loose fragments created a lot of turbulence in her psyche in the form of flashbacks and intrusive thoughts. The turmoil in her psyche was a result of her inability to have peace between her fighting fragments. She achieved cohesiveness of her fragments by engaging in a dialogue after her fragments from her subconscious mind transferred to her conscious. She was able to facilitate the meetings and dialogue between her fragments in order to keep them together. The process of unifying her psyche was based on her recognized needs for reconfiguration and restructuring. Her damaged psyche was reversed, and in several steps, she regained its lost abilities. Lola achieved unification of her fragments in a solid identity with newly obtained flexibility and plasticity. The flexibility and plasticity of fragments is a link between a split and a solid self. We are becoming plastic surgeons, the story of an uncertain mother. The mother of a small child unifies her fragments. She is the plastic surgeon of her psyche and establishes new goals for her whole self. She brings new domineering fragments to be in charge and changes the configuration of her psyche. The new goal for the mother is a better life for her child. When her goals change, her previously insignificant fragments become domineering and many unique surprises appear. Her dominant fragments, which are based on her oral sensor, have changed. Because her fragments are unified with the common goal of providing physical protection for her child, the fragments with the kinesthetic sensory modality are in charge. Her kinesthetic base becomes dominant and her other modalities become subservient. Her kinesthetic fragment represents a grandmother who is very powerful and takes over her psyche. Her fragment of the grandmother provides the psyche with a response for protecting her child. At the same time, a domineering grandmother's fragment takes away all fun from her life. The mother, a young woman, talks and acts like a powerful grandmother. When her behavior comes to her conscious awareness, she is not happy about her new structure. She develops more realistic goals. Her goal is to reinforce her strength, but she also does not want confrontation with the grandmother fragment. She only wants a structure where all fragments are actively cooperating and participating in common goals. Her rearranged fragments have enough flexibility and plasticity, so she is involved in the reconfiguration and restructuring of her fixed fragments. She decides to expand her goal of the physical safety of her child to a bigger goal, the future emotional stability of her family. She engages in a dialogue with her fragments. Unfortunately for her, as a child, she did not have a good life because of her overprotective mother. Her desire is to have a better life for her child. Her fragments participate in meetings, and she defines the meaning of what a good life is for her child. She changes the configuration of her psyche and brings the subconscious structures to her conscious awareness. On a conscious level, she identifies her various fragments and initiates dialogue between them. When she's not engaging them in dialogue, she involves them in the negotiations and then switches to dialogue. Her work is as exciting as the work of the plastic surgeon on her psyche. Loosely associated fragments. The story of Ola. Ola was a Norwegian male in America who came from a religious surrounding where the topic of sex was taboo. He suffered from his low self-esteem and did not feel that he was attractive or lovable. He did not feel like a real Norwegian. He mentioned that around the world the stereotype of a Norwegian was a strong, stable, and confident man. He mentions that he always ran away from the spotlight because all of his life he felt as if he was an imposter. He was unhappy because his fragments were loosely associated and were in disagreement with the others. As a result of his unhappiness, all of his life he was sexually frustrated and lately became addicted to pornography. His responses were based on his moral and ethical rules, which condemned pornography and masturbation. His main fragments were not aligned with the others. He had responses characterized by shyness, fearfulness, avoidance, and also a manipulation of others. His domineering fragments were kinesthetic and exhibited his feeling of sexual immaturity, frustration, shame, and guilt. Ola disclosed that his mother actually was not a Norwegian, but an Eastern European woman who spoke accented Norwegian. He added that during his childhood, the majority of Eastern European women in Norway were working as domestics and were considered as second class. He recalled that his mother was a farm laborer before she met his father, who came from a well-to-do family. He also believed that his father's actions were reflected on him, and he felt responsible for the decisions of his father, who married out of his class. He had a Ukrainian mother and never defended her because he was scared that others would talk about him as an ugly hybrid. Several times he overheard his neighbors having fun by imitating his mother's accent. He did not confront them, even though he felt very offended. Nevertheless, he did feel that he had done something wrong and felt guilty. Because of constant discomfort and fears, he did not feel comfortable and did not feel equal to others. He often thought that something was wrong with him. Ola said that his responses to distinct stimulations were shyness and timidity, and they were established in his kinesthetic sensor. He also reported that his reaction included rightness in his body and a restriction of movement. He was troubled when he needed to express himself verbally, the same way as his mother was, and he was uncertain of his abilities. The name of one of his fragments was Oleg, which was the nickname his mother had called him in childhood, and it sounded more like the Eastern European than Norwegian. Because he had a secret, Ola stayed away from the girls because he was afraid that when they got too close, they would tease him or get him into trouble. He was scared of many of his body's sensation, and he was unhappy and constantly in inner turmoil. Running away from danger, the story of Ola. Ola was able to identify a fragment that he described predominantly as the kinesthetic response. This fragment had the kinesthetic response for every stimulation. On the influence of his fragment, Ola ran away from numerous troubles to save the self. He realized that in his life he ran away from danger and was not strong enough to face unpleasant events. He attributed his feelings to his childhood experiences when he was afraid of his father, who physically abused Ola's mother in front of their children. Ola mentioned that his fears were stronger than any other feeling because they were more eager to get out of any tense situation than his curiosity wanted to see what kind of new development would happen. He declared that his attitude of running away saved his life. Ola added that many times in his life, when he was not in danger, the running away fragments took over his psyche. He felt that these fragments were beneficial and helped him get out of Norway and eventually brought him to America. Because he was very lonely, his life in an American big city was contradictory and unpleasant. He disclosed that he didn't know the language and lacked any marketable skills to have a social life and advance himself in America. He was crushed by his unpleasant feelings of sexual frustration and the danger of losing himself in the big city. He ran away from the big city to the forest, which reminded him of his native Norway. He worked as a lumberjack for an American timber company in Canada. He lived with the primitive villagers who were drunk more often than sober. After the work, the biggest fun for them was playing cards. He did not talk to them, and they did not bother him. He read a lot of books and studied English. In the forest, he used adult publications for sexual gratification. After being in the forest for a while, he went back to the big city. He emphasized again that running away from the city did something good for him. In the forest, he found a good use of pornography and of gratifying himself. With masturbation, he did not need to get close to a real woman. He felt that running away from danger was an important and beneficial part of his makeup. We are pretending, the story of Ola. Ola was not pleased with the number of his fragments, but he pretended that he was happy with himself. He was covering up a fact that he did not achieve a wholeness of his psyche. Nevertheless, he was proud of some of his fragments, which were based on his kinesthetic sensor and provided positive responses of him being a hard worker and having a good work ethic. Before running to America from his native country, he was a soldier, and he considered himself to be a good one. He also was a skillful lumberjack in the forest and a construction worker in the American big city. He was paid top wages for his job. Ola also recognized another fragment that was based on his visual sensor. This fragment represented a calculating and manipulative part of Ola's psyche, and it looked like a smart aleck. He was not ashamed of this fragment and was very thankful that he had it. Ola recalled that he became productive because of this fragment, which helped him to find optimal solutions to problems and provided him with practical responses. This fragment was free from fears, and because of this fragment, he was able to marry a good American woman. But he was not able to keep their marriage going for a very long time. He loved his wife, even though she was not a beauty queen. She was a very stubborn American, but did not have any intention to split him. Her stability helped him to build confidence and keep all of his fragments together. On top of that, his wife was wealthy, professional, and smart, and she helped him get an education, and she gave birth to his handsome son. Because of his wife's influence, he developed self-reliance skills and was able to prove to his employer that he was very valuable. In America, he was financially stable. Later in life, he hired an agent who watched out for his business and helped him in his old age. He mentioned that in financial areas, the manipulative fragment always took over his psyche and helped him to manage complications and thorny circumstances. Ola also had a troublemaker fragment that did not help him at all, and had actually sabotaged all of his endeavors. This fragment was very negative and operated on the visual sensor. Because of him, Ola saw himself as ugly and unworthy of love. He mentioned that his father was a butcher and had inherited a butcher shop, but his mother was a peasant Eastern European woman. His father was a wealthy man who married out of his class. He felt that his father's behavior was very irresponsible and was a weakness. He believed that his father put a big burden on his children because they came from a mixed background. He assumed that because of his shameful situation, no Norwegian woman would love him. Nevertheless, he was very close to his mother and felt that only she loved him. From America, he called her every week to Norway to talk. When Ola's mother passed away, his sister took his mother's place as his confidant. But it was not the same. He mentioned that his sister was a favorite of their father and did not remember their father as a scary person like he did. She remembered their father as very nice and their mother as very stubborn. His sister did not have any negative feelings towards his father, but he still remembered his father as a horrifying man. He remembered that his father tenderly kept his daughter on his lap and swore at his wife. In his memory, his father was fondling his daughters. but she denied it. After Ola's parents passed away, he continued his calls to his relatives in Norway, and they argued about their differing memories. He realized that he did not have anyone to whom he could relate. He believed that as a young man, he ran away from his relatives because around them he could not have stability and a wholeness of his identity. He believed that his relatives were disturbing his peace. Later, he understood that he did not achieve wholeness because he was pretending to be happy. Luckily for him, Ola relied a lot on his intuition. On an impulse, he married a woman who wanted him too, and that helped him keep his fragments together. He also knew that he did not have any real unity of his fragments, and in front of his wife he pretended that he was a real man. Somewhere inside he knew that he was in damaged goods, and he was afraid that his wife would find out. Eventually his wife realized that he was avoiding real intimacy, and sex for him was only a mechanical exercise. Because he did not expect any rejection, he felt he did not need to pretend. When his wife became sure that he was not open to her love, she made a move. She left him. He never remarried, and he never felt really happy, but he continued to pretend that he'd achieved wholeness. Pretension is the ruling force, the story of Ola. Pretension became the ruling force of Ola's psyche and was based on his false beliefs. Without any big commotion, he accepted the news of his wife moving to another state with a man, and she took their son with her. He was separated with his son, but Ola pretended that nothing terrible had happened in his life by detaching from his feelings. Deep inside, Ola did not believe that any woman would be attracted to him. He did not have any evidence of this, but he suspected that his wife had never really loved him in the first place, and he meekly went along with her decision to leave him. His belief was based on the conviction that he was not a lovable person. Because of his thought that he couldn't be loved, he never let anyone get close and pushed others away. He did not permit any woman to love him. Emotionally, he ran away from women because he did not trust them. He remembered that as a young man, he ran away from his Norwegian sweetheart. He only trusted his mother and his sister. As a child, he unsuccessfully competed for his father's love. Ola knew that his father loved his sister more. He also doubted his mother's love and felt that deeply in her heart she loved his sister more too. To get his parents' attention, he pretended to be scared and sick. Ola left Norway for America because he did not trust his family. The most important achievement was that in America he did not need to pretend. He said that he loved his family, but by being far from them, he felt at peace. All of his life, he ran away from every significant woman, which included his mother, his sister, his wife, and his girlfriends. Despite the fact that he deliberately abandoned any ties with significant others, he felt lonely and empty. To escape from his misery, he was good with philosophical abstractions, books, and art. He was deeply involved in the English language and spoke it without an accent. Ola had very good verbal capacity, which helped him to be popular with his friends and colleagues. He expressed very eloquently new theories and passages of scripture. Ola was religious, but did not replace his entire life with religion. Religion was his escape, and he often was involved in talks about religion because it was part of his expertise. The escapist, one of his fragments, operated predominantly on the oral censor. His verbal fragment helped him to be a valuable contributor to any intellectual conversation. Because of his skillful way of pretending and deceiving, he felt comfortable in the company of the young and naive. In his conversations, he pretended that he'd achieved wholeness. The roots of psychological addiction are in the fragmented identity, the story of Ola. As with other addictions, Ola's psychological addiction of going to prostitutes had roots in his fragmented identity and represented his impulsive behavior. By going to prostitutes, his domineering fragments wanted to keep his psyche together. On the subconscious level, they wanted unification with the loose fragments. It seems for that some use of a prostitute's service is a positive reinforcement and is a symbol of being powerful and successful. As gamblers, after winning, we sometimes go to the prostitutes because we want to celebrate our luck. The psychological addiction is also chemical and is on the level of our neurotransmitters. Our addiction to prostitutes, in many instances, is a complex one. It is based on impulsivity, which includes addiction to dangerous behavior, including rage, recklessness, gambling, stealing, and addiction to alcohol and narcotics. In Ola's case, the addiction to prostitutes skillfully covered an unstable structure of his psyche and kept together his loose fragments. Complete disregard of the roots of his addiction caused a low success rate in the treating of his addiction. Our addiction to prostitutes is equal to machismo and to our big egos. The root of addiction is a pretension that our psyche is whole instead of being fragmented. Our addiction is a powerful tool for covering up the presence of limited responses in our fixated fragments. Only a few of our fragments support the addiction, and they become dominant by controlling our neutral fragments. As they do not experience any resistance, they keep their domineering position. Our psyche does not know how to keep together the loose fragments, to keep the psyche unified. We keep the substance-dependent fragments as domineering, and we do not want to get rid of them. In some dysfunctional matter, our domineering fragments want only good things for us. They want to keep unity in our psyche. An addicted fragment always has a counterpart, a fragment that is clean from addiction and has a lot of common sense. Unfortunately, the healthy fragment does not have real power because it is presented in an uncommon sensory. This fragment has a mission too, and it covers up the secret of our psyche, pretending that our psyche is solid. Because it is clean, it easily deceives others. One of Olga's fragments was a physically abused boy, and even with a little stress, he recalled a very distorted past. His fragment was built on the visual sensor and contained the traumatic memories of his child abuse. Ola also had an abusive, ignorant, and macho fragment that operated on the kinesthetic sensor. One of Ola's fragments covered up his fixated fragments and his impulsive behavior. Ola's addiction to prostitutes was an attempt to detach from trauma. It was a process for unifying him with his neutral fragments. The first step of recovery is translating the responses, the story of Ola. In order to get control of his addiction, Ola needed to achieve cohesiveness. He translated his responses to his other sensory modalities. Because of his desire to escape reality, Ola's fragments were loosely associated and had fixated and neutral responses. His fixated fragments spontaneously took over his psyche. The fixated fragments did not have any flexibility, lacked the common goals, and did not have any agreement in perception. They did not communicate and opposed other fragments on the sensory forms. The fixated fragments of the kinesthetic modality humiliated the oral and visual fragments and vice versa. Ola's distorted perceptions were caused by the incongruence in communication between his fragments. He had a lack of desire to understand the differences in the sensory experiences, which complicated his efforts to get all of his fragments together. His fragments lacked references as to how to translate one type of sensory experience to another. His kinesthetic fragments were incapable of understanding his oral and visual stimulations. Only the addiction to pornography kept Ola's fixated fragments together. His psyche strived for unification but would not give up the pornography, which was the main partner in keeping everything together. The work to change associations of distinct fragments is similar to a plastic surgeon's work. Ola was able to consciously identify and rearrange the structure and composition of his fragments in order to build relationships. He translated his experiences to discrete sensory modalities, and his fragments agreed with a common goal. The destructive behavior stopped when he rearranged the fragments in his psyche. The destructive tendencies were part of an old system and did not have any place in the new system. Ola's psyche did not keep the addiction to the pornography. To keep his fragments together, he appointed distinct, domineering fragments. Until the psyche was reconstructed in the cohesive system, he had the strong need for the psychological addiction, but now the addiction was not needed. Until the psyche was reconstructed in the cohesive system, he had the strong need for the psychological addiction, but now the addiction was not needed. The domineering, suppressing the neutral. The story of Danila. Danila was married to a Ukrainian woman and had children. In Danila's fragmented identity, the domineering fragments suppressed his neutral fragments. He was the son and grandson of alcoholics. The domineering fragments supported his chemical dependence, and the responses of his fragments were fixated and provided only limited feedback. His psyche fell apart because his fixated fragments disintegrated and dissociated, and only his addiction kept the system from complete disintegration. He was a good provider and kept his work as a car mechanic for 18 years. He did not drink during the business hours, but in the evenings he consumed alcohol until he was in a stupor. Despite his alcoholism, his fragments on the oral sensor had a good working ethic, and some visual fragments supported his need for stability. His psyche functioned as a productive one, and he was the type of alcoholic who did not have any desire to stop drinking and become sober. He hated violence and did not want to abuse his wife. Nevertheless, he drank and was an abusive husband. Danilo was motivated to restructure his psyche. He brought his conflicts to his conscious awareness and balanced and aligned his aural and kinesthetic fragments. In restructuring his psyche, he had two goals. The first goal was to find a way to verbalize his experiences. The second goal was the translation of the visual experience to other sensors. Danilo was translating his fragments to the kinesthetic sensor to help him. The abused little child on his visual sensor was protected by the strong fragment on his kinesthetic sensory modality. Translation of his experiences from one approach to another created in his psyche the atmosphere of understanding and support. He verbalized his experiences in a distinct manner, and his fragments realizes that their first priority was to keep them safe, because their emotional structure was damaged. It was the first step in the process of dialogue and unification. Danilo visually relived his experiences as the main way of representation. The balance of intensity of the visual, oral, and kinesthetic responses created an alignment between fragments that shared the same information. The visual experiences of him as a victim of violence translated to the oral experience, which allowed him to reach an understanding between dissimilar fragments. He translated his visual experience to sounds and created a better understanding of being a victim. The visual stimulation triggered a strong response, and he cried. He was recording the sound that later he was translating to the kinesthetic experiences. He then translated his visual experience to the kinesthetic, understanding that he needed to keep his fragments safe and to avoid unnecessary stress. He translated his experiences in steps, which was safer and less intense, and he recorded his yelling and crying. To stop his addiction, he worked with medical doctors who monitored his withdrawal stages and his translations. Danilo recorded his oral experience in the dissimilar intensities. He also translated the sound to movements. He listened to the sound and visualized the matching movements. When he was ready to reproduce the kinesthetic experience, he hit the pillow and yelled at the same time. He beat the mattress with all of his force. He had enough strength to avoid bruises, and he felt strong relief from the temptation to use alcohol. The alcohol was a means to keep the structure together, but he didn't need it anymore. The important fact was that the withdrawal, if not controlled, could cause physiological damages and may even have lethal consequences. The work on chemical dependence can be successful when the needed precautions are observed and the subject is closely monitored by a trained physician. After Danilo completed empowering his repressed fragments, the dominant fragments did not need alcohol to keep the others together. His fragments were released from the suppression of the domineering fragments to keep his psyche together, but there was more work ahead. The way to reach understanding between fragments. The translation of responses to diverse manner is the more simple way to reach an understanding between fragments. Danilo's fixated fragments had several sensory bases and were not aligned and balanced. The modalities were oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory. When he dealt with his inhibition, his addiction was better controlled. The factors of suppression were not on the way, and Danilo felt that his chemical dependence was easier to manage. He focused on various modalities. Where fragments were misaligned and detached from the experience, the translations helped him to deal with his addiction. He translated his experience to the oral modality from the fragment on the kinesthetic sensor. Some of his fragments responded with violence and physical dominance, inciting him to be a macho man. His psyche had fixated fragments that were violent, aggressive, and expressed his emotions and sounds. By recording his expressions, he was able to listen to his oral translations of the kinesthetic expressions. The oral match for his kinesthetic experience was mainly the yelling and swearing that he did in the translation of his oral experiences to visual sensors. In other words, he was visualizing his recorded oral experience. Daniela's translation to visual experiences was unique and tough because he saw so many horrible images. Daniela mentioned that it was problematic to estimate how long it would take him to complete those tasks. He added that it was impossible to predict what kind of visual experiences he would encounter. He acknowledged that, to be on the safe side, visualization may well be done together with relaxation exercises. He needed more time to have a translation of his experiences, because after the emotional turbulences, many fragments in distinct sensory styles suffered from psychological and physiological damage. Because of the painful ordeal Daniela had in his past, some of his fragments were terrified, handicapped, wounded, and not mature enough to sustain the stress related to transition. He needed to assess the damage to his fragments and move forward at his own pace. He relied only on the fragments that were mature and able to participate in the restructuring. By translating his experiences back and forth, he stimulated the process by balancing and aligning his fragments, building the relationship between the fragments on separate sensors. The new relationship between fragments provided the needed strength to overcome his stress. His psyche did not need any more addiction to keep the system from falling apart. He dealt with his addiction by restructuring his psyche. He had a lot of pain and suffering in his life, and he benefited a lot from this process of alignment. All his fragments shared the same psyche and learned to treat each other with respect and dignity. After achieving a state of dialogue and meeting, he experienced relief from the stress of craving. When real dialogue started, his psyche did not need any cover-ups or pretensions. He also felt that his fragments translated to the special sensors and that dialogues were going well. Now the process of recuperation from addiction was unstoppable. Psyches with comparable domineering sensors. Other people can have comparable domineering sensors, and there is a similarity in processing information. The similarity in domineering sensors, which can be oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory, provides a better chance for others to understand us. Their domineering responses are in the same style of expression, which is the very important psychological factor. We deepen our relationships when we understand others better. When we have the domineering fragments on the same sensors as others, we are more tolerant and have a better chance to reach agreement on numerous issues. When our experiences are translated from one sensor to another, the interaction between fragments becomes more productive and we can easily overcome disagreement when we translate assorted domineering sensors to one common sensor. Without dialogue, it is not possible to achieve wholeness of the psyche, and we have a goal to get all of our fragments engaged in dialogue. The self-actualization process has begun. The dialogues are between homeostasis and the desire for change. Our dialogues are in sounds, in images, in movements, and on a conscious level. Even our psyche structure resists any changes as we make an effort to keep our fragments together. We use addiction, fetishism, and other things to resist splitting. Our addiction keeps the pretension of wholeness, protecting our psyche from falling apart and resisting disassociation. Our various addictions cover up the split because we are not willing to deal with the lack of balance and alignments. In the self-actualization process, we do not pretend, and our psyche does not need to use addiction because, besides being a verbalization, there are other ways to process feelings. We translate our experience to the oral and kinesthetic forms in order to have a wider area of interactions and to become aware of others who have the same domineering senses and exhibit a similarity in processing information. We successfully identify the others with the resemblance in our domineering modalities. When we have a similarity in the processing of information, we are able to have more meaningful interactions. New fragments are a domineering force. The story of Karine. Karine, a middle-aged Armenian female with changing perceptions, was addicted to gambling. New fragments took over her psyche and became a domineering force behind her responses. In order to be aligned with new responses, the new dominant force altered her view on existence. When her new domineering fragments had cheerful responses, Karine's existence appeared bright. When her negative and irritable fragments took over, her psyche and existence was dark and uncomfortable. The disassociated fragments were atypical because they had a loose view on the past and present. Often, disassociated characters were not aware of others. There are loose associations between Careen's fragments, which continued to confuse her. Because of the recurrent changes, her perception was unstable. Nevertheless, her behavior was not completely disassociated, and she didn't block the feelings of existence. During the process of separation from her domineering fragments, some fragments did not disassociate and shared the same past and present. Careen had a fragmented psyche. She did not have a feeling of lost time, and she remembered all of it, but she had feelings of detachment from the present and the past. When Careen had internal conversations, she always addressed it to some unknown fragment in her psyche. Her psyche presented an unstable structure, and she appeared very confused. When her fixated fragment, which was carrying an addiction, became domineering, her behavior changed and her responses became unreasonable. Careen did not understand that her responses were abnormal and that they were out of the limits of common sense. She had a tendency to present absurd ideas and was constantly losing money by gambling, but she always went back to the casino and indulged in gambling. Her behavior did not make any sense. If Careen did make a right bet and win, she immediately risked it again and all of her winnings. She played recklessly and was unable to stop until she lost all of her money. When she talked to others, her logic and her train of thought did not conform to common sense. She said that she did not need to save money, explaining that even though she was not young, she did not care about old age and may not live to see it. Our common sense would say that a healthy individual should work and save money for old age, because when she is old, she cannot work and needs to buy things. Careen expressed the exaggerated logic of the extreme. Her logic was not popular because it did not conform to the general view. It was extremely blown out of proportion because the fixated fragment, which had an addiction, took over her psyche and became a domineering force for all of her responses. The process of splitting is resistant. The story of Careen. The splitting process in Careen's psyche prevented her from having genuine dialogue between her fragments. As a child, she was very sensitive to neighbors' gossip when she overheard. She had a fixated domineering fragment on her oral sensor that was very disturbing. She reported that when she was a child, her father left her mother for another woman. She recalled that her mother was always questioning the neighbors' words and did not trust them. She always tried to find vicious intent in the neighbors' idle talk. This domineering fragment, which represented part of Careen's psyche, was suspicious, insecure, and very sensitive to all oral responses. A little increase in the pitch of someone's voice made her uncomfortable, and she felt disrespected. She depended on her oral sensor, and to have a stable mood, she could not hear anything disturbing. She easily became depressed or agitated when she heard something negative. Careen also had fixated fragments on her visual sensor and had recurring flashbacks. One of the fixated fragments contained her childhood experience of being an abused little girl. Other fixated fragments reported other traumas. She was frightened because of the incident in an airport, where she was detained for taking out her family jewelry from the workers' paradise. She was threatened with arrest and separated from her son, who at that time was a young boy. She remembered his cry and how he called for her, and she had the flashbacks about those traumatic episodes. On the kinesthetic sensor, Careen had flexible and fixated fragments. One kinesthetic flexible fragment helped her a lot because she was a good healthcare worker and had good relationships with her patients. She was a divorcee, and her fixated fragment contained painful responses about her painful losses. She mentioned that all of a sudden many people were dying around her, including her father-in-law, her mother-in-law, her brother-in-law, and several friends, and she took care of all of them. They all died in the span of 2 years, and she remembered the sounds of their heavy breathing. She detached and had difficulty remembering things. Every time she tried to remember, she became sick to her stomach and felt pain and was very anxious. Careen's psyche split and she fell apart. She appointed the abusive oral fragment as her front. She was abusive to defend herself. Her mother was listening and telling her neighbors gossip, and they implicated Careen in those deaths, but she did not give her neighbors any room for gossiping in her presence. She was physically strong and angry and intimidating to others. In the meantime, she lost her fragile femininity and acted as a bully. Her false pretension of toughness and an effort to keep her fragments together influenced her to make stubborn bets. She became addicted to gambling. Carine was able to realize that her life was built upon false pretenses. It was a first step to achieving self-actualization and unification of her fragments. She was able to identify her fragments and understand the benefits of translating her responses of traumatic experiences to other sensory forms. She translated her experiences from visual to the oral sensor and recorded them. She produced animal-like sounds that were a precise illustration of her visual emotions. Her experiences also translated to the kinesthetic sensor, and still other experiences translated from the kinesthetic to visual and oral sensors. The translation of experiences opened the door for dialogue between atypical fragments. After the translation to distinctive forms, some of her experiences that suffered from loose association became less threatening. Her responses became clear and less distant, and she regained control of her emotions. Dialogue replaced the previous coping skills, which included disassociation and false pretenses. The process of self-realization for Carine included the mutual understanding that all fragments were part of the same psyche and needed to be tolerated. The real meetings and dialogues were on the way to achieve wholeness for the fragmented psyche. The suspicions and hostility between fragments were replaced by openness and trust. The desire to have a dialogue and a wish for unification are included in the ground rules of acceptance, embracing experiences, and compassion. Genuine dialogue between fragments is very important because through dialogue we can consolidate all of the fragments into a solid identity. The psyche clarifies, simplifies, and desensitizes experiences. The story of Carine. The psyche clarifies and simplifies our experiences by bringing them to conscious control. Carine translated the responses from one form of expression to other modes of expression. Her fragments were already identified and sorted in a special style of expression. If one of her fixated fragments had antisocial, psychotic, impulsive, or oppositional behavior, she was able to translate the experience to distinct sensors without judgment. The new understandings provided her with the opportunity to understand the splitting and to be aware how it affected her responses. The need for unification became clearer and more convincing. By translating the responses, Carine's psyche gained the strength to overcome splitting and was motivated for self-growth. She became aware that her fixated fragments had destructive tendencies. Her other fragments dealt with the delinquent fragment in the same way that a healthy family dealt with a member who got sick. Usually the family looked after the sick with compassion. The good family wanted to be sure that the one who was sick had appropriate care, a healthy lifestyle, and a supply of necessities. If the fragment was violent and antisocial, the response was translated to the diverse sensors, and the fragments and the various approaches were able to record and correct the undesirable behavior. The main motivation of the other fragments, to care after the delinquent one, was based on the understanding that the misbehavior of the delinquent fragment affected them as well. Our antisocial and immature fragments can be on any of the sensory types and can hide behind any type of response. Being addicted to gambling creates confusion. The fragments were manipulating Carine, who was able to convince her neutral fragments that the beliefs of addiction were temporary. Before, she had recklessly relied on the delinquent fragments, which were destructive by nature and could easily ruin the structure of her psyche. The reckless fragments could achieve splitting and hid behind very manipulative, demagogic responses. Those responses masked splitting tendencies by the seemingly appropriate contents. Carine's psyche was consciously aware of this situation. She had prevented the delinquent fragment from confusing the neutral fragments. We cannot confuse the fragmented identity with the multiple personality disorder. Both of them, in the eyes of the law, are equal and have the same responsibility to follow the rules and regulations. When disassociated fragments become multiple personality, nothing changes. Law and the system of punishment in society does not distinguish between loose fragments and disassociated identities. It punishes only the physical body. In the fragmented psyche, the fragments are supposed to be aware of what is going on. The law, unfortunately, does not care about the loose fragments. and indiscriminately punishes all fragments and all personalities that are part of the same psyche. The incorporation of multiple personalities to one personality helps to avoid underserved punishment. Nevertheless, the multiple psyches endure a lot of splitting in the process of incorporation and become fragmented. Carine felt proud of her work in self-actualization, and her self-esteem increased. Her psyche controlled the delinquent, immature, and antisocial fragments and helped the rigid, sick, and abused fragments to deal with the trauma. Her self-actualization became a success, and false pretenses were not needed. Her fragments involved themselves in genuine dialogue. The translation of her experiences to distinctive sensors created more opportunity for her fragments to understand her struggles. The work to solidify all fragments of the psyche became her main goal. We use the art of negotiation with others. In dealing with others, we learn the art of negotiation, but in relationships with our own fragments, we want to achieve meeting and genuine dialogue. To find middle ground with other individuals is a big achievement. But with our own fragments, we push for dialogue. We do not want any scapegoats inside our psyche, and we do not call our fragments by derogative names. We are on a mission to be nice to all of our fragments, even though the few that are rebellious and damaged. Our motivation is to engage the fragments in dialogue. We understand all of our fragments because they are part of the same psyche. All of our fragments suffer if we get sick or incapacitated. Some of our fragments are in opposition to dialogue and sabotage the healing process. The process of persuading our fragments is a very delicate one. The neutral fragments can also be convinced to join a dialogue and achieve congruence. We want a dialogue with our own fragments because the inner negotiations are a confirmation of the unresolved splitting. The meaning of the dialogue is a willingness of all of our fragments to discuss the problem and to find a solution. If they are forced to join a dialogue, the partners are unreliable. When fragments realize the importance of the dialogue, then eventually they become facilitators of the dialogue. This process has 2 steps. In the first step, the job is identifying, translating, and enrolling the fragments in a dialogue. In the second step, through the dialogue between fragments, the spokesman for the fragments can be elected. The spokesman for our psyche can be a real representative of all of our fragments and must honorably represent our solid identity. In our relationship with others, we look for negotiation. With other individuals, we do not share the same emotional memories. The recognition of our fragments helps us to recognize fragmentation in other individuals. In our life, we are responsible only for our actions. Society practices collective punishment for all of our fragments and personalities. If one of them has destructive tendencies, then all of us will suffer. Normally, we cannot have a collective punishment. In the lawful society, we are not punished for others' deeds. We get punished only for our own because we are responsible for dialogue between our own fragments. We can be very happy if we have dialogue with others, but it does not happen very often. In our relationships with others, our first goal is negotiation. If we eventually can be congruent with others, then we will be able to have a dialogue with them. Otherwise, our genuine dialogue with others happens on an intuitive level. In dialogue, we feel unification and have a real meeting. We also know our limitations. It is very sad that in many instances we do not have the ability to have a dialogue with others. We also cannot be accountable if we are not able to have a dialogue with others. We do not share with others our thoughts and beliefs, and at least it is good if we know how to negotiate with others. The main reason for problems with others is our unwillingness to create an atmosphere of negotiation. Before we have a dialogue, we need to learn negotiation. If we are involved in the negotiations, then we are successful in relationships. We do not ignore the fact that negotiation is not easy, and we need to learn the art of negotiation. To understand others, we may well make an attempt to see the world from another's point of view. To be a good negotiator, we identify the strength of sensory styles of others and then choose which sensory form in our own experience is more acceptable for our negotiation. The main purpose of negotiation is to understand the experience of others. In many instances, we translate our experience to others' sensory approaches because it is easier to understand others from a variety of sensory perceptions. The willingness to translate our experiences to a distinctive sensory style is a sign of flexibility, which is a prerequisite for our successful negotiation. In translating our experiences to diverse sensors, our skills become more transparent. With the translation of our experiences to the sensory experience of a partner, we transcend insignificant barriers. The negotiations may not become a dialogue, but we can make progress in our interactions with others when we have a successful negotiation. The verbal, nonverbal, and mixed way of expressions. When we learn the art of negotiation, we also understand that our fragments have a visual, kinesthetic, and oral sensory base, and have verbal, nonverbal, and a mixed way of expression. In kinesthetic form, we appropriately use a lot of our nonverbal responses like nodding our head or waving a hand. We use the verbal together with the nonverbal responses. Our flexible fragments translate our experiences to verbal expressions and help our domineering fragment with the verbalization of feelings. Our domineering fragments direct many of our responses, which stand in the front line as a spokesperson for our psyche. Our domineering fragments usually align with others that are on the same sensory style. When we have fixated nonverbal fragments, we do not understand what kind of experiences they express. It is important to identify those fragments and to engage them in dialogue with our verbal fragments. Because of various reasons, we are challenged to express the self in public, but we don't do it verbally, kinesthetically, and visually. When we are confused and are unable to express the self verbally, we use our posture. As a result, we express the self with weird movements, which sometimes reminds us of strange rituals, or we produce bizarre noises. It is the result of the fixated responses. We also use self-made rules and get a freezing effect that makes our bodies too tight, so that we seem to be in a stupor. We use fixated responses in numerous stimulations, not only expressing the self verbally, but also making sounds of crying, yelling, or mumbling. When we deal with our own atypical responses, we are aware of which sensory manners the deviations exhibit the self. The exaggerated reaction shows the excessive release of our chemistry, and the restriction shows that our brain is not releasing enough chemicals. It indicates that there is a deviation from the mean. We realize that one of our sensory styles, where the abnormalities are present, has fixated responses. We have an abnormal kinesthetic sensory base when we display excessive or restricted kinesthetic responses. Our excessive kinesthetic responses exhibit many unneeded kinesthetic motions, like when we spend a lot of time playing with a keychain. Our restricted motions demonstrate the suppressed physical activity, which includes being tight and impeding our movements. When we have an abnormal oral sensory base, we overreact to every sound and to internal voices. We are also inattentive, rambling, and guardingly reacting to verbal stimulations. When we are inarticulate, we get upset. When our abnormality presents on the visual sensory base, we remember only unpleasant things. We have flashbacks, have visual hallucinations, and are incapable of reasonably describing what we see in front of our own eyes. When we are careful and observe deviation, we do not provoke the increase of abnormality and do not trigger production of fabricated abnormal expressions. When we observe the movements are rapid and exaggerated, we do not want to mirror those movements. To level with abnormalities, we keep appropriate and regular movements. Sometimes we have abnormalities in all of our sensory bases. It happens when our fragments are oversensitive to sound, visual stimulation, and movement. We get agitated and angry even at little increases in the pitch of sounds, as well as someone's accented speech or an odd sequence of words. We get angry at someone who, during conversations, looks in the opposite direction. We get upset because many of the small things that make us irritable and angry. We become very nervous because everything we see, hear, touch, and smell does not satisfy us. This situation happens because we do not have the verbal ability to express our feelings. The situation gets tricky when we have negotiations with others. We are not sure what kind of feelings nonverbal fragments express. When we are forming responses and want to have successful negotiations, we need to be sensitive to the problems of others and have understanding of their feelings. First, we identify the sensory type which their fragments represent. If one of their sensory manners presents exaggerated or restricted reactions, it is a sign of imbalance in the brain's chemistry. We need to check our responses when we prepare for negotiations and others around us are easily annoyed. When others have abnormalities in their sensory styles, we need to adjust our own responses. To help others mirror our appropriate responses or switch to a dissimilar sensory approach, we use appropriate responses in the same sensory mode. Sometimes our mimicry and our movement are more suitable to one group. One group feels better when we are verbal, and another prefers the mixed approach. When we are not sure what someone's nonverbal message expresses, we can understand it through different domineering sensory styles. We respect the feelings of others in the same way as we respect our own feelings. To have a good guess about the feelings of others, we need to get in touch with our own fragments, which will pinpoint the appropriate manner for approaching others without hurting their feelings. We delegate responsibility to our own fragments that match others' sensory styles. This is a complicated negotiation. We choose our responses according to the situation and relay our intuition and the knowledge of the art of negotiation. Epilogue. We want to have a solid identity, a dynamic interaction between flexible fragments and congruency in our responses. We want our oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory fragments to be in constant interactions. We are in constant dialogue and meetings with all of our fragments. Inside our psyche, we have the strength to achieve harmony. We also must be aware that there is a utopia outside of our psyche. Our fragmented identity is under constant threat of further splitting. This knowledge does not bring us any satisfaction or pleasantry. Our analysis of individual psyches is based on the observation of several collectives. We also see our abnormal characteristics in the radicalized collective. The fragmented identity has a resemblance to the radicalized collective. We study our unstable structure to be aware of what we need to enforce. We have external dialogue and meetings because we want to have a solid identity. Until we have a solid structure, our dialogue and meetings with others are only intuitive. The radicalized collective has a pathological structure. We learn a lot from pathology and ought to avoid the structures that do not allow negotiation. Radicalized society is similar to a body that suffers from the invasion of a virus. It takes us over and does not give us a chance to function in our natural way. Some of us have a natural resistance to the virus, but others become casualties. We do not discuss how the collective is radicalized, but we observe how a radical collective affects us. We look at the dysfunction of the radical collective as a macro structure and learn something from it. The radicalized collective has a kinesthetic base in the form of marches and parades as an exhibit of loyalty to the collective. The leaders with kinesthetic expression and with verbal speeches radicalize the masses. The radicalized collective and fragmented identity have a similar structure. To survive, the radicalized collective creates psyches with fragmented identities. It has a visual base that is present in paintings, banners, and distinctive uniforms of the members of the collective. We see the verbal part of radicalization in the visual brainwashing of movies. Actually, in movies made in the collective, the domineering fragment is multidimensional and is displayed on all sensory modalities and radicalizes the others. The oral radicalization in the collective is exhibited in songs, books, and hymns. The fixated fragment in the movies is demonstrated by a refusal to compromise and an unwillingness to negotiate. Unlike the social collective, in our psyche we create a utopian collective. Our fragments share the same psyche and we take care of all of our fragments. We separate real people from their imprints in our psyche because we do not have the ability to create an exact imprint of others. We do not have a complete understanding of others, and initially we have negotiations with their imprints in our psyche. We want to achieve a solid identity and have the power to be involved in dialogue and meetings with others. We are going on a voyage inside of our psyche, and that is when we are able to create our utopian psyche structure. As a result, we can be successful in connecting to others who are outside of our psyche. Bibliography: Bandler, Richard, and John Grinder. The Structure of Magic, 1. A book about language and therapy, Palo Alto, California. Science and Behavior Books, 1975. Bowen, Murray, Theory and the Practice of Psychotherapy. In Guerin, P.J. edition, Family Therapy. New York, Gardner Press, 1976. Buber, Martin, I and Thou, 2nd edition. Translated by Ronald Gregor Smith. Edinburgh, T. and T. Clark, 1937. Friedman, Morris. Martin Buber's Life and Work, The Early Years, 1878 to 1923. New York, Dutton Press, 1981. Klein, Melanie. Envy and Gratitude, A Study of Unconscious Forces, New York, Basic Books, 1957. Kohut, Heinz. The Restoration of the Self, New York, International Universities Press, 1977. Rogers, C.R. A Theory of Therapy, Personality, and Interpersonal Relationships as Developed in the Client-Centered Framework, in Koch S. edition. Psychology, Study of Science, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1959.
This concludes Sailor Psychology, a methodology on self-discovery through the tale of a Semite in the Squall, by Dr. Chester Litvin, PhD psychologist, published by iUniverse. This book is in memory of my parents, my father, Max Litvinoff, my mother, Polina Gilmofarb.